Hello. Let's see. So today we're going to try to get through all of ants, which, we'll see how that goes. But while making this lecture, I just couldn't make it any shorter than what it is. And so I'm going to have a lecture on ants and a lecture on bees. And then we have a spider guest lecture and a avian ecology guest lecture. I'll do reptiles and amphibians and fish. And then that's probably all we'll get to under the auspices of this final third of the course, and then I'll upload sections on mammalian and possibly archosaur social behavior just for your enjoyment if you enjoy such things. Anyway, so maybe it's egotistical of me even to post them thinking that somebody might be interested in them, but I think it's pretty neat material. It's not about me, it's about the material. I'm going to post them anyhow. Anyway, so ants. There are about 22,000 species of ants, we think, on Earth, and we've described about half of them. And so even though there are oodles and oodles of people that study ant taxonomy relative to most taxa, because people are obsessed with ants, we still don't know how many species there are, and we don't think we've described more than half. That's pretty shocking, right? So there's lots and lots of things that were left on planet Earth that we don't know about, and lots of them are vanishing if that is a concern to you. All right, so all ants have elbowed antennae, which are like these little cruxes here that are characteristic of ants. So they're easily distinguishable in the fossil record and can be differentiated from their wasp ancestors. They have skinny waists like most Aculeata. And so bees have this, wasps have this, ants have this. They're a functionally diverse group. They can be herbivores, they can be carnivores, they can be omnivores, they can be gardeners of fungus, they can be lots of different things, because when you have 22,000 species of a taxa that's been reasonably speciose for about 50 to 75 million years, turns out they can do a lot of different stuff. So ecosystem functions, they are incredibly important in terrestrial systems, including tropical, subtropical, temperate, and boreal forests. They are more important ecologically as you get closer to the equator, but they are still not to be trifled with in temperate systems. They start to fall off in boreal systems in terms of their importance. They are major seed dispersers, so lots of plants produce these things called elaisomes, which are these tiny little like fatty bits of like basically like peanut butter for ants that are attached to these seeds, incentivizing ants to come collect these seeds, come back to their colonies, and then eat the elaiosome, but not actually eat the seed. And so these plants get to disperse their seeds all over the place because the ants will drop some of the seeds, they'll eat some of the elaiosome on the way, they'll get lost on their way back to their colony, their food will be raided by other species of ants, and even just moving back to a single place to another colony or to many different colonies because they're going to be foraged on by many ants. These plants are effectively dispersing their offspring, hinter and yon. All right, so the seed dispersers, there's soil disturbances. So ants produce nests that are oftentimes in the soil, and then they aerate the soil. They produce physical disturbances. They make the soil loose, and that allows certain kinds of plant species that would otherwise be unable to establish in various kinds of plant communities to establish. So they're an important generator of diversity in plants and plant population dynamics by moving propagules around the forest. And then finally, a lot of these ants have evolved to defend specific kinds of host trees and host plants, and so they're major defenders of those host trees. And then because many of these species of ant are predators, they can limit pest numbers and herbivore numbers that would otherwise mow down the forest, especially economically or ecologically sensitive plants. So hooray for ants. They do lots of important things, and we owe them a lot of money. All right. Their colony sizes can range anywhere from just a few dozen individuals in relatively basal ant lineages in the old world to some species of ants that can have colonies in the hundreds of millions of individual workers and produce, natural wonders. Evolution. So all these ants are in a single family in the Aculeata. So they're in Formicidae. So Formicidae is a singleton family, contains all 23,000 species of ants, and that's impressive that it's a singleton family that contains all this diversity and all this functional diversity that turns out to be so ecologically important. So they evolved from stinging wasps, which I've mentioned previously, and they're the sister taxa to ants. So wasp, 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 and then in the last little breach here, there are ants, bees. So ants and bees are each other's closest macro taxa that they're related to. People think this has been bantered about for some time, and then they're all just highly derived forms of wasps, and especially successful wasps at that. All right, so the precursor wasp that gave rise to ants was an active arboreal predator, like in this top-hand side here, Haedomyrmex or Haedomyrmoides. Both of these are flighted active predators that roved around the canopy of forests in the Cretaceous and consumed prey insects, and were moderately social, but we don't know how social because they're all dead and in amber, and we don't really get to see what their sociality is like. However, early ants are basically just non-winged or just more terrestrial forms of these ancient wasps. And so things like Specomyrma on the bottom right-hand side here just is missing those conspicuous wings. Maybe there's some delicate wings here, but they're not as conspicuous. They're mostly associated with the terrestrial environment, and it's believed that some of them in early cases were subterranean, right? So ants were subterranean active foragers or terrestrial active foragers. Those were their early days. All right, so ants for a long chunk of their early history were not all that ecologically successful. They were not doing things like these acacia ants here, Camponotus, which are on the side of a thorn of their host tree, which are acacia trees that have evolved to make special domiciles for their host ants to live in. That's what you're looking at here, a little domatia, which is like a little hut that this acacia tree has created so that its host ants can make a little home there, and then when an herbivore comes to attack this host tree, then get mowed down. Anyway, ancient ants were doing anything like that. They were just wandering around being relatively active, terrestrial or subterranean wasps with reduced or absent wings, and just bebopping around, killing things like a normal wasp does, and has a little nest with its young, and maybe those young have multiple mothers that are producing their eggs in a shared creche type environment, and so maybe they're assisting each other like social wasps are today. So it's probably something like that on the ground or in the subterranean environment. However, the radiation, so at that moment in time, up until the early Cretaceous period, only about 1% of the insect samples that we see in amber are ants. So 99% of the insects that we see in amber at this time are things other than ants. Flowering plants evolved between 150 million years ago, 50 to 100 million years ago, I should say. And the flowering plants, when they took over the world, this was a concomitant increase in the diversity of many kinds of insects that exploited these plants or were mutualists of these plants or were reliant on them as some sort of resource or enemy or arms race, and ants were locked in all of those kinds of interactions with their host plants. And so when the flowering plants began to diversify, so did the ants that were exploiting them or leveraging them or co-evolving with them with mutualisms, et cetera, et cetera. So by the time we get to about 33 to 55 million years ago, suddenly 20 to 40% of the insects that we see captured in amber are these ants. And it gets even more obscene than that. So in some special cases, like 80 or 90% of the specimens that are found in amber, insect specimens that are captured in amber, are ants. So like somewhere between 100 million years ago and 30 million years ago, ants went from being relatively just like not that impressive of evolutionary success stories to, you know, one of the most abundant and ecologically significant invertebrate taxa on Earth, and therefore animal taxa on Earth. All right, so an individual life cycle of an ant goes a little something like this, and this is the same way it is with a wasp, and generally how it is with a bee too. Queen produces eggs. Eggs become larvae. Larvae have to be cared for, either by the queen when she's first founding the colony, or by workers subsequently, after she's produced her first workforce. Those larvae pupate into a complete metamorphosis. If they were fertilized eggs, they can become workers or queens, i.e. they're females and they're diploid. If they're unfertilized eggs, then they become males. So larvae are immobile. They're fed primarily via trophallaxis, which is pre-digested juices that are vomited from a worker into the mouth of this developing larva. Gets enough vomit, pupates, turns into a worker, and then immediately begins to vomit into the mouths of still developing larvae and cleaning eggs and caring for the queen. All right, so colonies have a shared stomach, so everybody's vomiting into everyone's mouth all the time. So they basically have one panmictic stomach that they use to prevent starvation. And so the individual foraging ant that is outside of the colony, while it might get some sort of pre-digested juices and come inside and vomit into another ant's mouth, there's probably a conga line of anywhere from 2 to 500 individual ants that fluid gets vomited into and mixed between before it gets to these larvae, right? So there's just like, it's like a network of trophylactic individuals. Yes, some larvae in some species of ants are also provided small prey, just like larval wasps are, but that is almost completely replaced nutritionally and more derived species of ants. And almost every ant that you see primarily has its larvae fed through trophallaxis. So colonies have this like collective stomach. That's quite neat. So what creates a queen versus a worker? Well, queens and workers are both diploids, they're both females. However, it's mostly nutrition. We don't really know for lots of taxa what differentiates the queen from the workers, but almost every time that we do know what happens there, it's some sort of developmental environment trigger that can be brought back to nutrition. Queens are just fed something special or just more of stuff to become a queen. And then if they're restricted in terms of their diet, either from key nutrients or special chemicals or key amounts, then they become workers. All of that parental manipulation hypothesis that we talked about at the end of last lecture. Brooding chambers. So brooding chambers, whenever there's a nest that isn't a single chamber, but there are many chambers in a nest, brooding chambers tend to be one of the deepest, darkest, warmest, and most humid pits in the colony. And that's important because it gives the developing eggs and larvae, which are quite sensitive, a constant thermal environment, so they're not exposed to the cold or the heat on the surface of the colony. They are easier to protect from intruders and invaders, so that's much less likely for a foreign agent to get into the interior of the colony, into the brood chamber. The queen's usually in there, and she's quite important because if she dies, we're not producing fertilized eggs any longer, no more workers for us. And then it's a human environment as well, so it prevents desiccation. So easily defended, nice temperature, nice humidity, all maintained, relatively homeostatic. And when an ant itself is so small, it can't really maintain homeostasis in its body like you and I. They have to use the nest of a colony basically as a kind of macro anatomy, a structural anatomy to create homeostasis like we use with like air conditioning and like vaulted ceilings in the south and giant windows to produce air movement, airflow. These ants do the exact opposite by basically just binning the most delicate physiological elements of their life cycle, the most vulnerable aspects of their colony in these homeostatic chambers that they create in the ground or in twigs or in trees or woven together in leaves and trees. I mean, there's 22,000 species here. So like, cut me a break here. There's a lot of different things that ants can do, and I'm trying to teach you all about ants in a lecture. Don't you judge me. All right, we're moving on. All right, we're moving on. We have enough time for my theatrics. We can get through this lecture today, I hope. All right, so individual life cycles, searching for work. Just like I mentioned in the temporal polyetheism thing in last lecture, I referenced that ants do this. I'm going to say it again because it's just useful to know. Division of labor, once you have a multi-chambered colony, it's just gonna happen. The first, when an ant is born, it's surrounded by larvae that are still developing or pupating or eggs, and the queen's usually in the same chamber. And so what do you think they immediately start doing? They start tending the queen and tending the brood and tending the eggs and grooming the eggs and feeding the larvae, because that's the work, that's the job that's around them right now, right? So they got to do the job that's available to them right now. I just like saying the word job over and over and over. So they got to do the job that's immediately around them. Okay, so after that, they do things like excavating, and they defend the colony, and they undertake, they take out dead carcasses, or they chew up the carcasses and necrophagy and consume them. So they engage in like hygienic behavior, excavating behavior, and defense of the colony, which are still interior tasks to the colony, but are not in the brood chamber. So it's in other peripheral elements of colony that are closer to the surface. The last set of tasks that most ants ever take on in their life are external foraging tasks. They go collect plant material for farming, they go collect prey, they go collect seeds, whatever that colony eats, those foragers go out to collect those items and bring them back to the colony. This is also the most dangerous thing that a worker can do. And the reason that we think that, like adaptively, that old workers are the ones doing the most risky tasks is because they're going to die anyway, or they have a risk of dying anyway reasonably soon. And so you should send them out to do the riskiest tasks. An alternative, non-adaptive explanation is just it takes a little while in your life to bumble out to the exterior of the colony and become a forager. And so it has nothing to do with, like discounting the lives of elderly ants. But no one knows whether or not that hypothesis is true, that external foraging risk hypothesis. Like, No one knows if that's true or not. It's just a so story. It's a nice idea. No one knows. All right. We covered individual life cycles. Now let's talk about colony level life cycles. I said this before, but I'm going to say it again. All right. So there's a mating flight. So many colonies release their alates, ALLATES, which refers to reproductive individuals, can be both females, queens, and males, drones. In social insects, they like to make up a new word for everything, and usually 4 or 5 different words for the same thing. So welcome aboard. Alates. So alates are these reproductive individuals that fly out of the colony, mate with individuals from other colonies, queens and drones from other colonies. The queen then basically descends under the ground. She's all by herself. She starts excavating her colony. She lays eggs inside of her colony, and she rears the first set of workers on her own. The first set of workers, because they were reared by just one mom, who sometimes doesn't even go out to forage, it's all just like whatever she's got left over, she gives these workers. First set of workers, they're crappy workers. They're smaller, they're sicklier, less organized. There's like 6 of them, or 10 of them, maybe 20 of them. But then once that first set of workers are produced, that queen basically never does another thing in her whole life, right? Instead, she just sits there and poops out eggs, and that first workforce that she makes go out and collect all the food and feed her young. And then the next generation of workers that are produced now have 6 or 20 different moms instead of just one. And guess what? If you have 6 to 20 different moms taking care of you, you do better. So later developing workers do better. Most colonies die. Most new founded colonies die before they ever make it their first year, their first season. 90% of them will die or more before they ever get to having that second set of workers. By the time a year elapses, 90 to 95% of those queens that have been mated, gone, the colonies fail, they all die. If a colony makes it through its first year, it's got a pretty good chance for making it for 4 or 5 years. A colony has to be 4 or 5 years old before it starts producing new alates and can participate in this colony level life cycle. Many generations of workers have already elapsed. Countless of generations of workers have already elapsed. At least 10. I shouldn't say countless, like 5 to 10. So, but after 5 years, the colony begins to produce its own alates, few at first for the first few years, and then it starts to produce more and more alates and becomes a strong contributor to the panmictic population of colonies nearby. You can basically think of colonies like a somatic organism like you, and you can think of the queens and workers basically like sperm and egg that get spewed out into the air between colonies that unite in the air, mate, descend, and then found new colonies. Most of them are spontaneously aborted before they make it into the first year. Anyway, queens live a long time. Workers live 1 to 3 years. Queens can live at least 30 years. We think they can live to be 50 or 100 years. And even at 30 years, queens are some of the oldest, longest living insects that we're aware of. For an insect of its size, queens can live to be anywhere between 50 and 200 times longer than a comparably sized insect. That is an amazing amount of longevity. So these queens have evolved like, I don't know, like some sort of like preservative serum on the inside of their bodies to prevent them from aging. In their defense, or in our defense rather, these queens don't really do all that much. They just basically pop out babies. They're just a little baby maker. And then they have a certain amount of sperm that they have their whole lives, and they have to preserve the sperm, fuse it with eggs, and just keep on producing eggs. They don't have to feed themselves. They don't carry themselves around the colonies. Their legs eventually fall off, and they are dragged from chamber to chamber by their own workforce, their own children, and they're just a conveyor belt of food that's vomited in the mouth and babies that come out the back. Not really a queen in the way that I like to think about queens. Anyway, so colonies hibernate. So colonies become less active when it's cold outside. Why? Because these are ectotherms, so tiny little ants. It gets cold outside, they can't move. So for big chunks of the year in temperate and boreal environments, the colonies become inactive. In tropical regions, colonies just bebop around all year long because it's warm enough to always be working. All right, there's a big old slide. Mating flights. So let's see. So I mentioned alates before. So alates are here again. So, oh, that's misspelled. That's ALLATES. So sorry about my misspelling of alates. Oh, well, you'll figure it out. Anyway, so alates are dispersed from many colonies at once, like sperm and egg from different colonies. All right, so it's a mass event. It has to be timed between colonies because if you spew out your queens and drones at a time that's dissimilar from everybody else, then you're just going to be able to mate with individuals from your own colony, and inbreeding is bad for these colonies. So all the colonies usually cue into the same environmental features to spew out their alates at the same time, roughly the same time. The drones usually leave first. They then produce mating pheromones, usually on tree sides or on rocks or in some exposed area up in the sky, and that attracts female alates, i.e. queens, to join them. All right, so queens can mate many, many times, but males don't want to share the paternity with other males. So like, even though it's in the interest of the queen to have like as many different male students as she could possibly have over the next, like 2 or 3 days before she descends and likely fails in founding her own society, males don't want that to happen. Males want to have all of her eggs, just one patrilineline. So what do males do to try to prevent females from being overly promiscuous while they're in their mating flights? Males in many species have evolved sperm plugs that basically stop up the female's reproductive tract and make it harder to be inseminated by multiple males. It's not perfect. She can still get many, many males to inseminate her. It's just males have a selective advantage if they can prevent other fathers from siring offspring with that conveyor belt of eggs when and if she succeeds in establishing her own colony. So there are adaptations and counter-adaptations. Females are pretty good at digesting that sperm plug and then preserving the sperm inside of it for a long period of time. Sperm-sperm competition. So if you just take sperm from many male drones and put it together in a petri dish, they basically kill each other. The sperm kill each other. The sperm inside of the females are basically neutralized and prevented from killing each other because, as I've said before, those females have to be a living sperm bank for the rest of their whole lives. And so they have to neutralize that poisonous, basically Star Wars sperm inside of them. It's a little grandiose, but you get the gist. Anyway, so gist. All right, so some species, I already mentioned this. So some species, army ants, drones enter existing colonies. So, oh no, I did mention this. So in a very small subset of species, the drones from one colony actually enter other colonies, and they release a mating pheromone to let the new colony that they're invading to go mate with the queens therein know that they're not prey, they're not there to steal anything from the colony, they're not a social parasite or a slave maker, they're just wanting to mate with the resident queens. And so it's a way for them to get like a get out of jail free pass and go try to mate with any virgin queens on the inside of the society. This is pretty rare, but it's worth mentioning. Univoltine reproduction, all that means is that one voltine, so they're completing one generation per year. Bivoltine, 2 generations per year, et cetera, et cetera. Polyvoltine, 3 or more generations in a year. Anyway, univoltine reproduction means most of the colonies only produce one massive spew of alates, drones and queens, once a year. Queens found their own society, rear the first generation on their own, and then become relatively inactive. Queens, because like it's not that fabulous of a life. They don't have like a little crown, like they're not boiling birds in cognac and then roasting off their feathers and eating them in court, which was a thing that people did. But they're basically just a conveyor belt of offspring, more like a dystopia. New colony. So the queen drops her wings in order to start excavating. She excavates on her own. She lays the eggs. She cares for the young, all on her own. And in polygynous societies where there are multiple queens, sometimes queens do this together. It also should be noted that if a colony has many, many queens that are active within it, then they don't have to go through this weird mating flight thing. A queen can just go with a subset of the workforce, like swarming bees do, and found a new colony with an existing workforce. Not many species do this. A small number of species of ants do this. Most ants have this mating flight phenomenon, but a small number of ants, because there's 22,000 different species and they all do lots of different things. Some species of ants in a polygynous, i.e. multi-queen society, a subset of the workforce will leave with some of these queens to found colonies on their own. When they do that, then those new daughter societies are much more likely to be successful because they've got a huge established workforce moving with them. They don't have to build it all on their own from scratch. They don't have to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. All right, communication. So ants use a lot of different kinds of communication. They're probably most famous for using things like pheromonal communication. They use pheromones for attracting mates, like those drones use to attract the queens during mating flights. Trail pheromones, where ants will go out, they'll find food, and then on their way back from food, they'll release a chemical trail, a trail pheromone, that alerts new members of the society that when they're leaving the nest, that there's food in that direction. They don't release that pheromone, that trail pheromone, on their way out. Nope, don't do that. They only release the trail pheromone on their way back from successfully finding food, because that's their way of saying, I don't know exactly where this food is relative to the colony, but I'm going to find my way back to the colony, and I'm just going to put like some chemical breadcrumbs behind me so that when I get back to the society, there is a path to get to the food. New workers follow that path as best they can. They then find the food. If they don't find the food, they just get back to the colony. If they do find the food, then on their way back, they release a trail pheromone. And that means that basically that path gets upvoted, 10, 20, 100 different times, and soon every member of the colony is able to find that path very reliably. And that means that the most permanent food, the food that persists, that still needs to be attended to and collected, has a very strong trail extending from it. All right, other ways that pheromones get used. They get used for alarm pheromones. Hey, there's an intruder. It just tried to kill me. Heads up. Trophallaxis pheromones. Trophallaxis pheromones. I mean, there are pheromones that are released to cue trophallaxis from fellow members of the society that have a local effect. Cuticular hydrocarbons, these are the fatty molecules that cover the surface of the ants that are basically used to defend the ant from possible desiccation. Basically, it covers itself in like a Crisco, so it doesn't dry out when it's outside of the colony. But when it's wandering around in this like greasy Crisco, molecular Crisco, and it touches things outside, little bits of volatile and non-volatile chemicals basically get stuck to the grease, and then ants can taste those cuticular hydrocarbons with antennae, and then see where other members of the colony have recently been, what they've been doing, what they've tasted, what they've seen, etc. So cuticular hydrocarbons basically serve as like a messaging board molecularly attached to each and every one of the members of the society. So they basically just crowdsource taste different messaging boards and try to figure out a lot about their environment, both inside the colony and outside, just by tasting the traffic of the individual ants going around them. Seems pretty neat. Stridulation's kind of cool. That's where they basically grind together little bits of their joints, and they can produce like little vibratory acoustic sounds that ants can basically talk to each other by giving little tactile communication or seismic airborne communication via these little basically like weird violin organs on their not like a cricket, but like by grinding little ratcheted joints together, and that have a small local effect. But they can communicate to each other, and they're sometimes used to warn rivals that they've been spotted. So they can stridulate to warn a rival that they've been spotted to try to scare it away, and they can communicate things like agitation using stridulation inside of the colonies, little seismic communication. Defense. Ants can defend themselves. So ants have a central place, a colony encased inside of a material called a nest, that they defend from other rival ants. Sometimes the places where they build their nests are quite difficult to attain. They're quite rare. They're the right kind of tree, the right kind of spot, the right kind of rotting log, the right kind of rotting stump, whatever. Those things are rare. So being able to defend that sort of territory, which is valuable, or that resource which is valuable, is an important driver of enhanced elaborate sociality. And that's why people think, in many instances, why ants have evolved very high levels of sociality. So they're a model of the fortress hypothesis for enhanced social evolution. The enhanced ability to defend a central resource like a fortress have enhanced higher levels of cooperation, and stings are more effective when you're being stung by hundreds and hundreds of ants rather than just by one, right? You're much more likely to be dissuaded from using a resource if you're being attacked by hundreds or thousands of ants rather than just one or two. All ants bite. They can bite with their mandibles, right? And that's mechanically irritating, like, ow, it bit me. Many ants can bite you with their mouths, but then take their abdomens around and either sting you where their mouth is getting you, or they can spray chemical irritating spray into where their mouth has already locked onto you. And so they can sting you as well as bite you. So they bite you, basically latch onto you, and then use you as leverage to get their butt around to sting you or spray irritating chemical volatiles into your open wound. In any case, they can sting you either by direct injection or chemical spray. Some species of ants have quite potent defenses. So jackjumper ants, the stings can actually be fatal, and there's a developed antivenom for them. Bullet ants from Central and South America have the most painful ant sting of any known ant on Earth. They have these weird rituals down there, which are actually quite interesting, where like adolescents coming of age can put on like weird gloves filled with these bullet ants that then basically sting these people to the point of being exhausted, and they pass in and out of consciousness and hallucinate. And this is how you become like a man or an adult woman member of the society, adult woman or member of the society, by basically just mutilating your hands to very painful insects. I would recommend it recreationally, but it has been a cultural phenomenon in Central and South America. Fire ants, many of you probably are familiar with being attacked by fire ants during your vacations to the sunny Southeast United States. Anyway, they're medically relevant, so if you're susceptible to them or allergic to them, they can really mirage you. They can kill animals, they can kill dogs, they can kill calves, they can kill lots of things. If they have enough individuals overwhelm whatever animal has descended upon the nest accidentally or intentionally and regrets it. Trapjaw ants basically ratchet their jaws open and then quickly fire them closed to cleave prey, to cleave intruders, and these spring jaws on the fronts of trap-jawed ants are some of the fastest appendages on Earth, and they're the fastest predatory appendage in defense. That's a lot of qualifiers in that sentence. The fastest predatory appendage in defense. It's a lot of qualifiers. But anyway, needless to say, they can produce really fast, rapid movements with those jaws. They can snap, and they produce an impressive amount of force as well. They can actually send themselves flying out of traps by just basically taking their trap jaws, putting them on the sand, and then just firing off their jaws. You can send the ant flying, and they do that to get out of antlion nests, or antlion traps, I should say. Colony defense, in-group, out-group, aggressiveness. How long have I been at this? I feel like I've been at this a while now. Anyway, I'm gonna check my time in a second. In-group, out-group defense. One of the things that's amazing about ants is that they're able to have in-group, out-group morality. So they can identify members of their colony, and then they're nice to members of their colony, but yet they can be incredibly aggressive to things that are not members of their society, right? If you're not a member of my colony, even if you're the same species as me, I'm gonna attack you and try to kill your rival. But if you're inside of my society, I'm going to take good care of you. I have a whole different set of instincts. Many animals on Earth don't have this nice compartmentalization of like, I'm aggressive towards these things. I'm docile towards these things, and they're totally separate. Lots of animals, the most aggressive individuals towards one set of stimuli are more aggressive towards other sets of stimuli. And so there are trade-offs for being too aggressive towards one context, not aggressive towards another, etc. Ants don't have to deal with that. They can tell who's in their society, who's not in their society, be nice to the individuals inside of their society, and be aggressive towards everybody else. How do they do this? They can taste the cuticular hydrocarbons, and they're familiar with cuticular hydrocarbons of fellow members of their society, which are characteristic. If they taste foreign cuticular hydrocarbons, they attack, usually. Now, in a special set of instances, you can get things called unicoloniality, which is where every single colony of that species no longer attacks each other. The whole species has in-group morality applied to every colony of its species. They still maintain high levels of aggressiveness to all the other species, but they just have complete conformity in terms of their docility towards other societies of their species. This is a rare phenomenon, and so it gets a special like moniker, unicoloniality, one giant colony. It's not seen all that commonly, but ants do it reasonably frequently, but they only really do it when they're invasive. So that means that the species is occurring in a region where it doesn't normally occur. So it might be from South America, now it's in North America. It might be from North America, now it's in Asia. It might be from Asia, now it's in Africa. And so it's now interacting with a whole new community of ants and indeed not ants that it's exploiting and competing with, et cetera, et cetera. Most animals that get moved across the globe and show up in a new habitat, they die. They don't become established. And if they do become established, they don't become abundant enough to become pests. But some species of ants not only establish, but become pests and become economically expensive pests, and many of them are unicolonial. Because if all of the colonies are being nice to each other of this species and not fighting with each other, they can reach alarmingly high densities. This is a fire ant nest here on a yard in the southeast US, and these are all these other colonies. If these colonies were not unicolonial, they would fight each other, right? They would have heightened levels of aggression, and they would maintain large territories, and they wouldn't be able to reach these high abundances, these high densities of these fire ants. And that would be advantageous because they would cause less damage if they weren't so dense. More native species of ants could subsist and persist if these fire ants didn't reach those high densities, but yet they do. And if you think about it, it's of the dozens or hundreds of ant colonies that showed up in the Southeast United States from Central or South America, depending on which invasion we're talking about, only a small subset establish. And of those that establish, one or two of the genotypes will be enormously successful. So basically you have a very low level of genetic diversity that first shows up in the establishment portion of an invasion in a new habitat by this invasive species. And so that lack of genetic diversity, we think, is what allows them basically to not really see any differences between these new colonies that are joining the immediate vicinity, because they're so closely related and they share so much in common environmentally that they just lose the capacity to be able to differentiate their colony from other colonies of their species that are closely related. And indeed, in an invasion, they're all very closely related. So that's bad, because that means that they can reach alarmingly high densities. There's no aggression to keep those densities down, so they become quite costly. They outcompete native species that don't have this advantage, and they're not wasting any time or energy fighting with their most common rivals, because their most common rivals can't be differentiated from themselves, from their own colony members. I hope that that's clear as a topic. I think that that's pretty neat. Do I want to go through suicidal defense? I guess it's not that far to the end. I'm just going to finish it. All right, suicidal defense, easy peasy. Some ants are so, they're already sterile, right? It's not shocking. If you're not going to produce any babies, then this just opens up huge amounts of adaptations to, for the good of the colony, do crazy things as a worker to defend your colony. Suicidal defense are classic examples of these. Camponotus on the right-hand side here, they used to call them kamikaze ants, but they decided that that was politically incorrect for readily obvious reasons, and they weren't totally wrong. So these ants, they basically burst these mandibular glands, and then it just sprays out caustic acid as a chemical deterrent on intruders. So this ant, if the fight isn't going all that well, can basically burst a set of glands in its anterior end that spew out chemical defenses like an acid that melts or otherwise immobilizes these invaders. So if that ant had any prospects of reproduction, things like this certainly wouldn't evolve, but because it's not going to reproduce anyhow, might as well have a chemical bomb attached to you from the interior that you can spray out some juice against a foe at the last possible minute if things aren't going that well. There are species of ants in Central and South America and Southeast Asia that will have, Forelius is one of the most famous genera for this, but ants will leave their colony, which will have like a tiny little tube that entrance from the outside. A subset of the workforce will exit the colony when it's stressed and thinks there's about to be an attack. The workers that go outside will destroy the nest entrance, make it collapse in on itself, and then those workers are just sitting outside, waiting to be killed by whatever's about to attack the colony, but the colony's all sealed up, right? Now the colony's in a little protective sarcophagus, so it will be just fine. But the workers that basically demolished that entry tube, they're all gonna die. All right, lots of ants also self-isolate. So if an ant worker can tell that it has an infection that could be socially transmitted, the workers will oftentimes just leave this. If it can't be cleaned off, if it can't be groomed, if it can't be nursed back to health by other members of the society, those workers will just leave their colony, wander off, and die somewhere in a field, die somewhere off in the desert. Because if you're not going to reproduce, you're living for the colony now. You're living for the queen. And so if you've got an infection and it can't be cleaned out, then you should just skedaddle, get out of here, and don't imperil anybody else, buddy. All right. There's just so much content in this that I think I'm going to assemble this with the bee lecture. I won't add that much additional content. I think it's been 40 minutes. I can't tell. I didn't start my stopwatch, but I am getting tired now. So I guess I'm going to stop it here, and I'm going to add the bee lecture to the end of this, which will hopefully be on Wednesday. All right, I'll talk to you guys later on. Take it easy. Have a good one. We'll talk about living, the various kinds of nests, and then superstructures that ants can make instead of nests or in addition to nests when in a pinch next time. Take it easy. Bye. Oh, for real. Bye for real now.